In any emergency, there are things you do first. When someone goes down in cardiac arrest, you pump their chest to oxygenate their brain until someone can help defibrillate their heart and hopefully restore a normal rhythm. You stop the bleeding before you worry about a broken bone. I sat on the patio trying to figure out what I needed to do first. I didn't have the slightest idea. This was a first for me. I was completely blindsided. As a certified critical care nurse, I developed a talent for observation. I would intuitively pick up subtle signs that a patient was in trouble long before they started sliding down the tubes. Then I would take appropriate action. That ability saved lives. But I never noticed the signs and symptoms that my nearly 18-year marriage was in mortal danger. The only decision I made at this point was that I had no intention of trying to resuscitate it. On the contrary, I intended to pull the plug from the socket. And I intended to make that demise as painful as possible. After some thought, I reconsidered my intention. I wanted it to be painful for my soon-to-be ex-wife, but there were innocent parties involved. I didn't want them to get hurt when I went after the cheating bitch and her lover. I took another sip of my beer and looked around the backyard, contemplating my possible actions. With the exception of a couple of oak trees and 3 pecan trees, I had grown a level grass lawn that stretched from my patio all the way to the bayou. We had enough snake problems in Louisiana already. There was no need to create additional habitat near the house. My only concession to shrubs was the azaleas in front of the house. The house behind me was large, with 4 bedrooms and 3 baths. It had a traditional Southern-style covered porch. Other than that, there was nothing traditional about it. Inside, it had all the best modern conveniences available at the time it was built. The plumbing and electrical systems were top of the line. No corners were cut during construction. The state-of-the-art kitchen had never been remodeled, but appliances had been replaced over the years. The roof was covered with solar panels. There was no way I could afford this house and the 8 acres of land around it on a nurse's salary. It was a gift from my father and grandfather when I announced my engagement to Bonnie. The land had been in my family for generations. My grandfather and father built the house themselves, or rather, the construction company they owned. Fontenot & Sons was well known in our neighborhood and was now run by one of my cousins. My father and his brother were pretty much retired by now. Pope passed away 2 years ago. He was a little disappointed that I refused to join the family business, but he respected my decision to go back to nursing school after first getting a degree in business administration and trying to work in an office for several years. I wanted nothing to do with the construction profession after working in the heat and humidity during my high school years and during college vacations. I was never interested in making money for its own sake. I only had enough to take care of my family. Of course, that included being able to afford some pretty luxurious toys. I had a very nice boat that we often used for fishing and camping trips, and a pickup truck to haul it overland. I bought whatever fishing tackle I wanted. I had rifles and shotguns like all normal Cajuns. I took my family on vacations when I could carve out time to work as an assistant head nurse of the intensive care unit at our local hospital. I always provided my children with equipment for their own activities. Other than patient care, family was the only truly important thing in my life. And now my family's happiness was in jeopardy. I glanced around the 200 yards that separated me from the neighboring house and saw a woman walk out of the back door. Except for the furniture and color scheme, her house was an exact replica of my own, right down to the same plot of land. My grandfather had built my sister's house right after he finished mine. We shared a dock and boathouse on the bay. I raised my hand to get her attention, and she headed in my direction. We needed to have a serious talk. "Aren't you a little early to start today, Rob?" "It's only 2 o'clock, she asked, pointing to the beer in my hand. "A whole cooler?" she asked, looking at Coleman next to the lawn chair I was sitting in. "I'm off for the rest of the week, and I'm in the mood," I said quietly. She knew I worked 4 12-hour shifts and then took at least 3 days off a week. Sometimes I took 1 day off after another to go on a short trip without using vacation time. I enjoyed working overtime. It allowed me to pay for a few extras. I don't want to waste time running back and forth to get a beer. I reached into my refrigerator and offered her a single mug. She opened the lid and sat down. "So what was so important we had to discuss right now? I almost shit my pants when you asked me to take a day off work and come home. Especially when you said I shouldn't call anyone before talking to you," offered Susan. "If you hadn't told me that no one was hurt or dead and that it wasn't an emergency, I would have just freaked out. But you don't seem that concerned." I know you didn't just call me home because you need a drinking buddy. Cutting to the chase, I said, I found out a couple hours ago that Bonnie is cheating on me. I got an email. I tried to say it like I was just discussing the weather, but my voice shook. Are you sure? I mean, it would be a cruel joke, but are you sure someone isn't just messing with you? She asked incredulously. I nodded and said there was a video file attached to the letter, and there was no doubt. Who sent the letter? I don't know, I replied. It just said, you should know that your wife is cheating. Here's the proof. I'll send it later. The man's name was Pissed Off 999. I've never heard of him or her. Susan considered my words for a second or two, then launched into a tirade. That cheating bitch, she bellowed. How could she? Doesn't she know you'll destroy both her and whoever she's having fun with? Why, I'll pull her down on her bald head. Don't mess with us coons. So do you know who the guy in the video is? I nodded and opened my mouth to answer, but she interrupted me. If Rich ever cheated on me, I'd just destroy him. Speaking of which, how does Bonnie even find time to have an affair? She's home almost every night. Well, except for our bachelorette parties with her friends, and I'm always there. She doesn't even pretend to look at other men. Plus, she works with Rich, and they drive to work together most of the time. He would realize she's having fun. Susan paused, and I realized she had finally noticed my startled expression. My sister was always a quick thinker. No way, she exclaimed. She's cheating with my husband? They're cheating on us? With each other? Her face turned from red to scarlet. Tears appeared in her eyes. I'm so sorry. I was hoping to tell you this gently, I said, leaning over and enclosing her in my arms. I've had a couple hours to think about it and calm down. Well, at least enough to not pull out a gun and go crazy. She cried for a moment, then stiffened. The legacy of her cunny ass was spilling out to the surface. She never doubted that I had just told the truth. Okay, what do we do? Wait for them to come home and then kick their asses? Asked Susan. I love the bastard, but I'm not going to put up with that shit. No. We're going to get smarter, I said. We don't give the appearance of guessing. We're acting the same way tonight as we did yesterday. We will greet our spouses with a kiss. Susan frowned. I'm serious. You have to act normal. We have to work out a plan. We'll get legal advice tomorrow. The good thing is that we know we haven't contracted any STDs, unless you're kidding too. I added with a smirk to take away the irritation. Susan pointed a finger at me. Hell no. I didn't even think about it. Well, not seriously. You know me. I might joke about becoming a TV star or something. But there's no way in hell I'm going to star in a movie. She finished the rest of her beer and tossed the can into the trash can with the other pacifiers. I handed her a full one as she held out her hand. And just for GP, I'm not going to do this with Rich either. I just got my period 5 minutes ago, she laughed. This is going to last until we bring the hammer down on those cheating assholes. He's not going to get anything. Not from me, anyway. Bonnie can help him if she wants to. She'll be glad to have his cheating ass. And we mustn't let the kids know about this, I warned. At least not yet. Susan wanted to know where they were. I tried to send them all to visit Mom and Dad this morning, but they didn't leave until a little while ago. They finally left when I came out here. Daddy has some projects he wanted the boys to help with, and the girls can do whatever they want. They took their time leaving, didn't argue or ask any questions. They just got in Jason's car and drove away. By kids, we meant my 2 children and her 3. They spent the entire summer with each other since we were all semi-restricted from normal activities due to the COVID pandemic. They didn't get separated on their own until they were still in school, but even then they looked out for each other. The oldest was my son Jason, who was 17. Rob, named after me, was the oldest with Susan, who was only a few months younger than Jason. Her twins, a boy named Dave and a girl named Cindy, were a year younger. They were 16 each, as was my own daughter Deirdre. Having 5 children within 2 years was both overwhelming and gratifying. 5 babies and then toddlers. It wasn't easy in those early years. After that, the baby factories closed. But as the children grew older, they became more like siblings than cousins. Rich had always been a good father and uncle. He took an interest in the children's schooling and helped them with their studies, But although I helped them with their studies, most of the fun outdoor activities seemed to fall to me. I never played sports, so I treated the kids the way I was raised. I taught them the skills I learned myself growing up. I took them camping, fishing, and hunting. When the kids were little, we would go camping in the backyard, away from the house, but not exactly on the bayou. Of course, the girls insisted that they too have the opportunity to participate and have equal time. So I would take the boys with me, and a week or so later, the girls. It was a great bonding experience. As time went on and the kids got older, we went farther and farther out into the swamp on excursions. It was getting crowded with all the kids fishing, so I would get Rich or Susan involved in driving the other boat. This allowed Rich to get out into the wilderness, as he called it. But for the last year or so, he let his sons run his boat while he stayed home. As they got older, we didn't take only small amounts of food with us on trips. It was usually condiments and spices, a bag of dried beans and some rice. If the children wanted to eat, they had to get their own food. Anything caught was shared, but if the booty was not very plentiful, we might not eat well that night. The kids gladly accepted the challenge, just as I had hoped they would. My kids, that's what I called them all, were tough as hell. Self-reliant, but understanding the value of family and teamwork. They learned to work together as a unit. Just 3 weeks ago, I rearranged my work schedule so that I had 6 consecutive days off. I drove one boat with the girls as passengers and the boys loaded into another. We traveled slowly to avoid snags in shallow water. Several times I stopped the boat so both girls could take turns driving it. The boys were also switching places. We spent a week at the old Paupo fish camp, did some fishing, and even went downstream to fish for crabs in the brackish water. We fished for bait with cast nets or turned over half-decayed logs looking for crickets and frogs. We totally bonded as a family, or so it seemed to me. Apparently, Bonnie and Rich didn't care much for family unity. My heart was breaking at the mere thought of telling the kids about Bonnie and Rich's affair. Family was everything. To destroy that unity from within would be unforgivable. That's what I told Susan. We can't hide it from them, she said. But we can delay it a little. I'll be careful not to let them know anything is wrong, she promised. So what do we do next? There's no way I can forgive or forget infidelity. I just can't. It doesn't matter what Bonnie promises or how she makes excuses, said I. Susan nodded. I can put up with a lot of things, but not infidelity. I'm going to get rid of her. Just need to figure out how to do it without losing everything. As much as I'd like to turn her into alligator shit, I'm not going to risk going to jail. I also can't let her take the kids. Likewise, I can't stomp Rich in the balls or break his legs. I have to be there for the kids. I drained my beer and opened the fridge for another. Okay. Putting aside my real desire to see Rich's left nut put on a fishing hook while he watches and cries, I see your point, offered Susan. The next thing to do is break him financially. I'm going to take every penny I can get. I'm going to make him pay child support, alimony, child support, and everything else I can. I agreed and said she could do it since Rich made more money than she did, but Bonnie could drive me to the pen since the courts favored women in divorce cases, as I'd learned from people I knew. Look, in my job, I mostly handle trusts and wills. But as a paralegal, I know enough about procedure to know that we have more protection than you think. You're forgetting that our major assets are protected, Susan said, smirking, with a malicious expression in her eyes. They can't touch our houses. Daddy gave them to us, and he did so before we were even married. He made sure to put them in our names only. Bonnie and Rich can't claim them. I'm not sure Bonnie can get a judge to let her stay in your house until both of your children are gone. But I do know that she has no claim to the house itself. She can't even claim the improvements you've made, like the solar system. Well, that's doubtful. Boats, cars, trucks? Well, yeah, half of that she can get. But not a house. Come to think of it, didn't you and Bonnie sign a prenup when you got married? Asked Susan. Dad insisted I do it. I thought it was all nonsense at the time, but he told me you signed one and he said he copied yours. I had completely forgotten about that prenup. Bonnie's father was a plastic surgeon and made a lot of money. He wasn't at all happy when I got his only daughter pregnant, coming home for summer vacation during her freshman year of college. She had just graduated from high school. In his mind, I was a wild card. That assessment had some truth to it until I met Bonnie. I never touched another woman again. His attorney drew up a prenuptial agreement stating that if either party was proven guilty of adultery, they would leave the marriage with only 20% of the accumulated joint assets. No alimony or maintenance would be paid to the guilty adulterer. In Louisiana, a prenuptial agreement can get around community property laws if it is signed by both parties before marriage. My father-in-law insisted that we sign one. He was convinced that sooner or later I would screw over his little daughter and take half of the fortune he planned to leave her. The only exception was 401k accounts. My own father knew of this agreement and insisted that Susan and Richard sign a similar agreement when they married a few months later. It took years before my father-in-law finally realized that his little girl was in no danger from my cheating. I eventually changed his mind. He knew I was respected by the other doctors in the hospital system. At one point, he even suggested I go to medical school and offered to subsidize my tuition. I, of course, declined. I was happy where I was. Too many of the doctors I knew seemed to be workaholics. They made good money, but most of them worked insane amounts of hours. Family time at home was too important to me. I'm worried about that video of Rich and Bonnie having fun, Susan offered unexpectedly. Holy crap, I thought. I mean, who filmed it? How they filmed it for themselves and it was found online? So many questions. As far as I can tell, there were at least 3 cameras there, I said. The video I got was not edited. It showed the same event from each point of view. That suggests that whoever was filming had at least not yet edited the raw footage. I watched it several times. One thing that caught my attention was that neither Rich nor Bonnie looked in the direction of the camera or said anything, as if they knew the camera was there. There wasn't even any slip of the tongue. I don't think they even realized they were being recorded, said I. Susan insisted I pull out my tablet and show her the whole video. Holy shit, she exclaimed. Rich and Bonnie's intermittent comments on the video about how Susan and I knew nothing about their lovemaking infuriated Susan. Rich is finished, but I still have a problem with whoever made the damn video. We have to find out. I don't want it to bite us in the ass in the future. I don't care if the whole world sees it, as long as it doesn't reflect on us. I agreed and said we should hold off on a public reaction. Susan sat silent for a few minutes. It seemed to me that she was just pondering what we should do next. Then I heard her sobbing. The sobs quickly turned to sobs. I reached out and hugged her. I couldn't stop my own tears. Neither of us could hide our pain any longer. I wasn't really drunk that night, but I had gotten a little carried away. I had a half-full beer in one hand when I met Bonnie at the door, hugging and kissing her to welcome her home. I half expected her to pull away and leave for the shower. Instead, she grabbed me and aggressively kissed me back. I sniffed her hair and neck, trying to catch even a hint of aftershave scent. Nothing but her own subtle perfume. I had just worked 4 days on a 12-hour shift at work. But suddenly I remembered what I'd learned today. I was so angry I could barely restrain myself from doing something bad. I took a sip of beer and told her dinner was ready. She looked at me like I was crazy when I abruptly stopped playing and said, "Let's eat." As I walked away, I heard her mutter quietly, "Damn. I was hoping you'd eat something." But it wasn't food. Susan and I had already planned to order takeout today. Neither of us were in the mood to cook. We joked that if we did cook, we could poison our spouses without hurting the kids. The levity between us didn't really bring relief. It was just a safety valve that kept us from exploding. The next morning, I watched Bonnie get her roguish ass into Rich's car to drive to work. I called Susan. "How'd it go?" I asked. "No problem," she replied. I would have flipped out a few times if we hadn't joked and planned how we were going to proceed yesterday. "I'm guessing he's planning to hang out with Bonnie tonight. Any idea where they're going?" I could tell she was lashing out, blowing off steam. Susan had always been a bit of a loose cannon. But right now she was still raw and needed to talk. We needed to be honest and frank about our feelings, at least for a while. If the conversation was rougher than is customary between brother and sister, we would go through with the ordeal. Well, I'll settle for that too. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Susan and I found ourselves in the office of one of her bosses. The fact that Susan handled most of the trusts and wills at the same firm wasn't a problem. Jake had gone to school with us. He was a pretty good divorce attorney and agreed to represent us. He was a true friend. "Okay. Are you sure you have a videotape that clearly shows both parties, namely your spouses?" asked Jake. We assured him that we had irrefutable evidence, but chose not to show it to him. "Not yet anyway. He shrugged. As long as you have hard evidence of infidelity. Good. I familiarized myself with your prenuptial agreements. They're pretty strict. Rob, I can't believe you signed something like that. You didn't consult a lawyer about this, did you? I told him I did. I mean, my father insisted on getting a legal opinion. And then he used the same document for Susan when she married Rich. Wow. You could really screw around if either of you started messing around. What it boils down to is that the party who cheats only gets 20% of all the joint assets. This includes savings, bank accounts, stocks, etc. The key thing here is that there are no provisions for personal income accounts. Do any of you have income, annuities, royalties, or anything like that that no one knows about? Susan and I shook our heads. What kind of account are you talking about? I asked. Okay, replied Jake. Suppose Bonnie had an account that she opened on her own, even before you were married. Maybe the money she got at your wedding. You know, when they put bills on her. Legally, she could even claim it was her money, plus any interest she might have gotten. Even if she took that money and put it into a business, the whole account would belong to her. I nodded. Not a problem, I replied. What if she has money she got after the wedding but didn't tell me about it? I asked. Common property. Like if you bought a car or a new boat and didn't tell her about it. Some of the trouble spots are improvements you've made to your homes. The homes belong to you on your title. They are protected because they were gifted to you before marriage. Upgrading refrigerators or furnaces are replacement costs, as are home maintenance costs like repairing or repainting walls. But you both installed solar panels. A judge may or may not decide they're part of the common property because it's a major improvement on which common property money has been spent. So? I mean, she only gets 20% because she's a cheating bitch, right? I asked. I'm willing to let her have that. Hell, she can claim the same because of all the furniture we bought. And we can negotiate that in our favor, too. You can even insist that she take her 1/5 of the property and move it off the premises. She'll have to pay for its transportation and storage. Jake grinned. That could be a pain in the ass. And more trouble than good. She might just agree to give it to you. It's little games we'll play as we go along. The important thing is that you both have ironclad prenups, as long as you can prove adultery. But I'm warning you, make sure the copies of the video you have are well hidden and confidential. Do not release it to the public. They can and most likely will sue you if it gets on the internet. Well, if they can prove that you filmed it and posted it. If they filmed it themselves and it accidentally became public, that's their problem. It all depends on how the video was obtained. Best to be careful. Jake watched us carefully to make sure we understood his point. Susan and I nodded. We had already talked about editing the video and sending it to all our friends and family. The only thing that had held us back so far was the backlash against our children. Now we were even more eager to find out who was filming what was happening. The next item was when we wanted to get the divorce papers from our in-laws. We decided on Thursday at noon. I suggested we wait until Friday afternoon. Then they would have to spend the entire weekend pondering their predicament, wondering what Susan and I knew. Plus, they wouldn't be able to get legal advice over the weekend. Jake changed my mind, saying that the longer we dragged this case out, the more it would cost. He said he was going to require financial statements from each of them showing their personal assets. That's going to keep them busy all weekend. Plus, it's probably going to increase their legal fees. If their attorney even talks to them over the weekend, it will bill them higher than usual, he said. At first, Susan and I wanted them to be served in a way that we could observe. We even discussed taking them out to lunch on Thursday so we could attend. Jake laughed and said that as fun as that would be, it wasn't a good idea. In the end, we decided to serve them at work in front of the entire staff. We said goodbye to a grinning Jake and headed to the bank, where we were to spend the next few hours transferring money. We discovered new checking and savings accounts in our names only. We made sure to get statements for all the accounts and then transferred 80% into our new accounts. Unfortunately, our spouses' cars were paid off. We fantasized about their cars being repossessed and having to walk to work. Both families were so frugal that we had virtually no debt except for recent credit card purchases. We paid off the credit cards and canceled them. We opened new accounts in our names only. It took a day or two to get the new cards. Jake warned us not to try to hide our activities and to keep paper records. I checked my email. I had 3 other attachments where Bonnie and Rich were doing it. It was the same room as before. I thank you for your help. I replied to my mysterious benefactor via email. But I'd like to know how you got those videos. I'm also worried about them getting on the internet. I hope that doesn't happen. I actually secretly wish that each of these videos would be edited and released to the public, making Bonnie and Rich stars. But after talking to Jake, I decided to be cautious. We wanted to make sure Rich and Bonnie couldn't link Susan and me to the publication and file a civil suit. In my defense, I could pull up my own email account. An hour later, I received a reply. It was a simple address. 9203 Victoria Street, apartment 201. I headed there to find the apartment building. As I expected, the woman behind the counter wasn't going to tell me who rented the apartment. At least not right away. Look, I suspect this apartment is rented by my brother-in-law for an illicit affair, I began. I received a blank stare in response. I need to know if he's a tenant. Same blank stare. I decided to change tactics. Okay. I can see that you don't want to tell me if it's his apartment or not. But here's the thing. He's known to be a drug dealer and was involved with a white slave-selling operation. You know, whores. I spoke thickly, but what can I say? I was doing it off the top of my head. What would your other tenants think if the cops, FBI, DEA, and even ICE swooped in here and cordoned off the entire building? Maybe do an apartment search? Do you think that would be good for business? Would your tenants be happy? That got her attention. What do you really want? She asked, frowning. I smiled back. Who is renting this apartment? And for how long? Said I. The printout was in my pocket, and 5 minutes later I was in my car and driving away. For the past 2 years, the apartment had been rented to the insurance company that Rich and Bonnie worked for. The contract had his name and signature on it as an authorized person. I had no idea who discovered it, but Rich's little love nest had been exposed. I wondered how the company would react if they discovered they were paying for Rich's affair. I mentally flagged that I would find out someday. Bonnie's reaction to being served was swift and angry. She called me at 12:30. I wondered what had happened in the 30 minutes between receiving the notice and her call. What the hell do you mean? Do you want a divorce? She demanded. I almost choked when I simply told her that I knew she had found someone else, so I was going to set her free. I didn't mention that I had videotapes proving what a cheating bitch she was. Susan and I rehearsed our answers. I just hoped my sister kept the same calm when she was interacting with Rich. What are you talking about, asshole? Adultery? Growled Bonnie. I know there are people here who wonder why Rich and I are so close. I've heard that crazy rumor myself. They've been going around for a long time. He's my brother-in-law, for God's sake. Are you really such a damn idiot that you believed some secretary or whatever that Rich and I are having an affair? Yeah, I guess so, I said softly. Well, if you're that stupid, let me tell you what happens if you insist on it, Bonnie said. If you want a divorce, go ahead. You can move out. I'll get custody of the kids and you'll pay child support. Big money. I'll get half of all our stuff, including your precious boat and truck. I'll make sure you have to sell them to pay me back. Not to mention the rest of your camping and fishing stuff. I'll live in the house and you'll pay the bills. And I will pursue every penny of child support I can get. And I don't have a boyfriend now, but I'm sure I will. I know Sue served Rich too. Hell, he can live with me and you can pay for it. Ha! You can move in with your sister and wonder what Rich and I are doing in my house. Is that what you want? Go ahead, said I. Get yourself a lawyer. I barely restrained myself from breaking my voice. From regret that my marriage was falling apart and anger that the bitch was sticking to her opinion of my innocence, I was ready to explode. Not to mention her immediate counterattack. I hoped Susan hadn't revealed too much to Rich. By the way, the girls are packing your things. Susan has instructed the boys to pack Rich's things. Everything will be stacked in front of the house so you can pick it up this afternoon. We got a restraining order and changed the locks this morning. You two will have to find another place to stay until the court decides who gets what. Bonnie started yelling and I hung up the phone. 10 minutes later, Susan texted me. Backyard. Bring your refrigerator. Make sure it's full. That bastard Rich, she began, sipping her beer. He started with, hey baby. You can't believe what some secretary would think just because Bonnie and I are close. I told her that Bonnie had also accused some unnamed secretary. I recounted Bonnie's reaction. The idiot pretty much denied that they touched each other at all. He told me we can't believe a word of it. I swear, if he were here right now, I'd hit him so hard he'd look like a pig. I told him to get his stuff. Really, I told him to call first because I was opening the door with a loaded gun. Jake is going to be here in a little while. He said he has 2 sheriff's deputies on standby to keep an eye on the situation and keep problems from getting out of hand. I didn't want to pay for the deputies to stand around and watch Rich and Bonnie load their stuff, but Jake explained that it was a good idea in case Rich showed ignorance, and I reacted. I realized what he meant. He was afraid Rich would say something and I would jump on his ass and end up in jail for assault. I was angry, but not angry enough to lose control of myself. I was already in the controlled panic mode I used during emergencies with a fallen patient. I knew that having a sheriff's deputy present was a smart move. The whole event was emotional. I'm glad you were the one to talk to the kids earlier, Susan continued. There was no way I could tell them what was going on. I broke down and started crying just listening to you. We got the kids together, and I told them what was going on. I really didn't think I could give my speech without breaking down, but somehow I managed to do it. I managed to address a calm but concerned nurse who told the family that their loved one didn't have long to live in this world, and they should visit and say goodbye to him while they had the chance. What surprised me was how the kids took it, Susan said. They acted like they expected it. I mean, when you said, guys, it looks like your mom and dad are up to something, and you all know that neither Susan nor I can handle cheating. Neither of them blinked an eye. You don't suppose they've already guessed it, do you? I don't know how they could have guessed, I said. I had no idea about it until a couple days ago. But they all nodded and got right to work packing up Bonnie and Rich's stuff. Maybe they're in shock, or maybe they don't realize yet how this could affect them. My phone beeped, showing a message. I glanced at it. I got an email. I wonder if it's from Pissed Off 999, said I. Well, check it out, insisted Susan. When I told her I didn't know how to do that on my phone since I only talk and text, she laughed and picked up my phone. A few taps on the icons and we heard the audio file sent to me. Can you believe Robert and Susan served us? Said Bonnie. They must have found out somehow. My goodness, what are we going to do now? I can't believe this. Just last night, Robert was all lovey-dovey. If he hadn't been so drunk, I think we would have done it right there in the living room. I didn't even realize there was a problem, and now this. Relax, said Rich. They don't know anything. Not really. Someone around here has blabbed something about us having lunch together or driving to work in the same car. You've heard the same stupid rumors I've heard. Nobody knows anything. No one can know anything. We never touch each other or hold hands in public. No more than any brother and sister in the world, maybe less. It's just an unfortunate turn of events. I'd love nothing more than to leave town with Rob and Susan as we planned. But this is premature. The kids are still in school and we haven't sorted out the money. For now, the idea is to deny. If they turn out to be dumb enough to go through with this divorce crap anyway, we'll make them pay. I got a guy who'll take our case. An old frat brother. I'll give him a call. Just be careful you don't admit to anything. Our position will be that they're listening to bullshit rumors. No proof, no case. But don't say anything you don't want to hear in court. Act like everything you say is being recorded. After listening to this audio file, Susan and I were silent for a few moments. Okay, so we don't know anything and we're listening to rumors, said I. Let them think so. At least for now. I know you picked up on what Rich said. They've been planning something for a long time. He's had that apartment for years. It makes me want to flip them and shove their plans up their ass. I'm concerned about the money situation he mentioned. We need to make sure we're protected in case they do something illegal and we get caught. Susan nodded. I didn't need to see the tears in her eyes to realize how painful it was for her to listen to that tape. We have to hold firm. I know, said Susan quietly. Jake said my situation is better than yours. The courts are favorable to women in general. I just can't accept Bonnie being given custody of Jason and Deirdre and being allowed to live in your house until Deirdre turns 18. A prenup might help with the division of our stuff, but if she can live rent-free while you pay child support, that's horrible. I thought the same thing, but hugged my sister while she cried for me. I assured her that we would come out victorious, even though I wasn't so sure myself. There were no winners here? The purpose of divorce was to minimize losses. The children fell silent as they heard Susan and me enter the house. Deirdre and Cindy had packed as many of Bonnie's clothes as they could into suitcases and bags. They were now using plastic garbage bags. I asked them to take pictures of the luggage they were using. I didn't bother to explain that I planned to apply the value of that luggage to Bonnie's share of the community's total assets. Every little bit helps, I thought. We went next door to see how the guys were progressing. They were almost done. Not only did Rich have fewer clothes, but the boys were stuffing them into the available containers rather than folding and packing them. I grinned as I watched Rob, Rich's oldest son, stuff a $2,000 suit into a bag like underwear. They had my back. I briefly wondered if the boys would tell me or lie to me later if I peed in that bag. I decided not to put them in that position. On our way home now, the text message I received from Bonnie read. I immediately called Jake. He showed up 15 minutes later, accompanied by 2 sheriff's deputies. Jake smirked and told me to relax and enjoy when I asked him if he paid those deputies to stand by. Bonnie and Rich pulled up in his car. Another familiar face pulled up behind them. Boudreau Landry. Talk about a Kunak mentality. Boudreau was a bully we'd known since elementary school. He was also dumb as a rock. How he had the smarts to make it through college, let alone law school, puzzled everyone who knew him from his early years. But somehow he'd managed it. Hey, Robert, he called out with a smirk. He pronounced my name Robert with an accent. I hated to hear it out of his mouth. When my father pronounced it the same way, it was an affectionate address. I realize you're having a little trouble with your wife and son-in-law. You know it's no big deal. I swear, if I had a firearm at that moment, I would have put a bullet right between that bastard's eyes and not blinked an eye. I knew better than to try to fight him. He was 6 feet 3 inches and weighed at least 300 pounds. Even if most of that weight was on his stomach, I couldn't fight him on my best day. I could run and let him chase me until he collapsed from a heart attack and then kick him in the head when he fell. But anything else was out of the question. Hey, Boudreau, I said hello. How's your mom and them? Good. We seem to have a little problem. Just trying to work it out, he replied. Then, as if flicking a switch, the Cajun disappeared. You don't seriously think my boy Rich is entertaining your wife, do you? Asked Boudreau kindly. His wolfish grin told me that Rich trusted him a little. He knew they were having an active affair, but he was going to defend himself with rumors. Well, the story is that's exactly what's going on, I said. Jake moved close enough to hear me. I just can't deal with it, you know. It's not something this old guy can put up with. Well, the story is that's exactly what's going on, I said. Jake moved close enough to hear me. I just can't deal with it, you know. It's not something this old guy can put up with. I dropped that Cajun nonsense as quickly as he did. I stepped back. You took almost all the money out of our bank account, accused Bonnie. Yes. And I have statements to show how much was there originally, said I. When we do the property division, you'll get exactly what you're owed. She stared at me. I didn't bother to tell her that her credit card would no longer work. Let her find out for herself. Neither Susan nor I accompanied Rich and Bonnie to the house to see if there was anything they could get later. My daughter Deirdre and her cousin Cindy followed Bonnie and one of the sheriff's deputies around the house. I told the kids that their role was to make sure that neither Rich nor Bonnie did anything funny. I didn't specify exactly what funny might be. I hoped they would figure it out for themselves if it happened. Jason and Rob followed Rich as he looked around his house. Where's my jewelry? Bonnie asked. I knew this was going to be a major point of contention. We had taken several trips over the years, Caribbean cruises and all-inclusive trips to tropical resorts. Each year I bought Bonnie a very nice piece of jewelry. We were picky. The gemstones were of high quality. Tanzanite, emeralds, rubies, diamonds. A few years ago, a simple appraisal for insurance purposes estimated their value at no less than $25,000. Needless to say, Bonnie was very unhappy to learn that most of her jewelry was safely locked away in my safe. Boudreau started to make his point, but stopped when I pulled out my cell phone to take pictures of the ring on Bonnie's right hand and the necklace around her neck. I took pictures of all the items for insurance, I explained. I wanted to make sure those items wouldn't go missing only to find out that Bonnie sold them to her girlfriend for 10 bucks. Being able to prove that they belonged to her would prevent that from happening. They are common property, just like my boat and pickup truck, which Bonnie said she would take from me today. Bonnie, as I expected, grinned. Boudreaux, on the other hand, looked at me with a speculative expression. I wondered if the fact that I actually had a brain in my skull could be called respectful. I prudently remained silent, so as not to confirm his assessment or refute it. Jake, who had been watching, stepped in and explained that we were all looking for the most accurate appraisal of the society's assets, and explained that Bonnie might even be willing to turn in the ring and necklace she was wearing so we could do a new appraisal at one time. After all, he pointed out, the ring and necklace existed, as evidenced by my photo, so why not get an up-to-date appraisal? After a quick consultation with Boudreaux, Bonnie calmly removed the jewelry and handed it to me. "So where am I supposed to go, you ass?" asked Bonnie. I was very close to saying, "Why not to your Victoria Street love nest?" but held back. I shrugged my shoulders. I realized how much my emotions had changed. Just a few days ago, I had been hopelessly in love with this woman. She and our children were my life. Now I didn't care about her at all. I was terribly angry at her, but at the same time I felt cold toward her. Bonnie and Rich finally got into their cars and drove away. Boudreaux followed a few minutes later. I voiced my thoughts, wondering if they were going to take their things to the apartment. Jake smiled. "I hope they are. I have a man following them. Disclosing this apartment at this time will help our negotiations." Unfortunately, they had thought of that themselves and went to the Holiday Inn not far from their office. Cheerfully, I helped them get their things inside. I was to buy some more flash drives to store backups of the audio and video files they sent me. Susan and the girls were making dinner at our house when my phone beeped, reporting another email. She followed me into my room to sit down at the computer. "Okay, guys," said Boudreaux. "There's probably someone following Robert. You don't want him to find out about your apartment. That's why I insisted you stay at a motel and get a room with 2 beds. Make sure both beds are made up as if you slept separately. The investigator can bribe the maid to check. We'll use the excuse that you're sharing a room to save money." "Yes. It pisses me off when we leave even a little bit in the bank," said Rich. "It was really embarrassing when my credit card was declined when I tried to check in. Good thing I took the extra money out early. So what are we going to do next?" "I'm going to call the credit card company and see if I can open a new account over the phone." "Okay. You guys need to write some notes on your assets. Robert's already thought about jewelry. He probably already has a list. I'm going to talk hypothetically for the next part. If you have money or other assets that your spouses don't know about, you need to protect them. Legally, they are community property, but what Robert and Susan don't know about, they can't get their hands on. I would demand a list of these pieces of jewelry, but Robert said you've already had them appraised, so the documentation is already there. He was right when he said you'd sell it for a few bucks and then deny its existence. If you have a bundle of Krugerrands, I would suggest you bury it. If you have a secret bank account, make sure it only holds a small amount of money. They're easy to find. Naming your social security number is enough to start tracking, especially if the amount is large enough to report to the IRS. Offshore accounts are not traceable. Whatever you have at the time of settlement or filing a lawsuit can be safely divided. You don't want to be caught hiding assets at that point. You will testify that everything you present is true to the best of your knowledge. Lying can lead to a perjury charge. Do you understand where I'm going with this?" Boudreaux said goodbye. "So what do we do now?" asked Bonnie. "They can find our accounts in Baton Rouge. I thought we were safe using the office as an address." "Screw that shit!" exclaimed Rich. "I'll be damned if Susan gets any more of my money. We need to call the airline and see if we can fly to the Cayman Islands today. We'll open an account there in the morning. Then we'll transfer the money electronically. It's too late to go to the bank to get cashier's checks. I'll check the flights. You make the room look like we slept here. You make both beds, then you wet the tissues and ruffle the towels. You wet the shower. Don't forget to open the soap dishes and pour out some shampoo. Do everything you can think of to make it look like we spent the night here. And then we're leaving. I'll call the office and tell them we have tomorrow off." The audio file ended. "Do they have secret bank accounts?" sighed Susan. "But how? Where did the money come from? I see the bank statements and I know how much we make." He couldn't have hidden a lot of money without my knowledge. Certainly not enough to hide it in the Cayman Islands. I felt bad about it, too. Bonnie and I were getting $50 a week in cash so we'd have money to travel. Most purchases were made with a credit card, and we both looked at the credit card statement every month to make sure no one had made any unauthorized purchases or had the number stolen. I told the woman in the apartment that Rich was suspected of dealing drugs and keeping whores. I was just pretending. But you don't really think he's actually doing something like that on the side, do you? Rich? Mister. Straightforward? Susan snorted derisively. He wouldn't know where to start. But I'd never suspect he was cheating on me in a little nook either. We decided to leave the matter for tonight. There was nothing we could do about the hidden bank accounts anyway. We joined the kids for dinner. The next morning I drove to Jake's law office. I had already arranged for a jewelry appraisal. I always kept a list of all my firearms. It took a local dealer a few minutes to determine the combined value. I asked him for a fair price he could offer. There is no way I would have sold those firearms for the amount he quoted. But at least I had his estimate on paper. It only cost me the purchase of a new Glock pistol, which I wanted to buy anyway. Now Bonnie couldn't say no to me. Susan went to work to get a couple things done before the weekend. We met in Jake's office. I played him the audio files from yesterday. I'd really like to know who's sending you these, he said. How they could have bugged Bonnie and Rich in a hotel room is beyond me. A private investigator couldn't have done it so quickly. As for the bank accounts, we might be able to find out their balances, but that would require a judge's order. I'm not sure we can get one. Not based on this record. Besides, we'd have to find the account. That could mean hiring an investigator. I'll talk to the guy who does bank investigations for us. Maybe he can find something. But are you both sure you haven't had a lot of money go missing? We shook our heads. There's no point in putting so much effort for a small amount. If they were saving small amounts at a time, they must have been doing it for years. And I'm the one who started this divorce. If you want to act as quickly as possible, like you said Jake. Susan and I agreed that we wanted to get it over with. Jake agreed. In this state, divorce takes 6 months. But that doesn't mean you have to wait that long for a court date. Next week, we'll meet with Bonnie, Rich, and their jerk lawyer to go over the list of assets. Then we'll go before a judge to make a ruling. This state has Napoleonic laws. Probate laws are pretty tricky, but divorce is easier, especially in cases of proven adultery. I'll add on your behalf that counseling is not going to do any good. Judges used to schedule such counseling and still do in some states. Once the judge makes a ruling, you just wait 6 months and that's the end of it. Oh, Boudreaux Landry called me this morning and demanded that you release some of the money you withdrew from your accounts. An extra 30%. I told him we have a prenup that says the defrauded party only gets 20% of the assets. I sent him a copy. Of course, he demanded proof of adultery. I told him it would be presented in court. He wasn't happy about it, but there was nothing he could do about it. It's actually kind of funny to watch Boudreaux flounder. He's a pimple on the legal world's ass. I may have to figure out how to get an audio tape into the courtroom of him advising me to hide money offshore. He might not get disbarred or even sanctioned, but it would definitely embarrass him. I hated the very thought of being away from home, but I had to go to work on Saturday and Sunday. The head nurse claimed she couldn't fill in for me on those shifts. What if I start coughing and have to get tested for COVID? I asked. Would you be able to fill in for me then? Asshole, said Sharon. And I say that affectionately. Yes, I could fill in for you. I might have to be the only one who does, though. At least for this weekend. We need senior staff, and I have some business with relatives in Lafayette. They're not too happy that I missed the last time they all got together, and my husband has already said some nasty things to me for not leaving him this year. But I see where you're going with this. If I found out my husband was circling the drain, I'd turn into a crazy person. You've got a lot of vacation and sick days piled up, and shit like this certainly qualifies for an emergency vacation. Mental health is good for a sick day, and then we'll start vacation. I just can't believe Bonnie would do this to you. Hey, tell you what, I said. There's nothing I can do anyway except stay home and drink beer this weekend and talk to the kids and my sister. How about I work this weekend and you start my vacation on Monday? Wow. Really? Thank you. You saved my life. I owe you one, said Sharon. I can do that. I'll put you on vacation with no days off. I'll start with sick leave and then move on to vacation. You'll take as much as you need. Keep me posted. Actually, the work was a welcome relief. Weekends were always a little wild. Procedures were kept to a minimum, but we still had to be alert in the ICU. Maybe even more so than during the week. We were the eyes and ears of the doctors who, except for rounds, stayed home. I was a little taken aback when I saw my father-in-law waiting for me at the nurse's station when I returned from my mid-morning rounds. Hello, Dr. Prejean. What brings a plastic surgeon to the ICU this morning? I greeted him for the benefit of the other nurses. Most knew he was my father-in-law. I was sure the others would be quickly informed. None of the staff knew about my family problems. Nevertheless, one way or another. John, as he insisted I call him in private, was not pleased. Cut the crap and let's go talk, he hissed. As soon as we closed the door to the head nurse's office, he said, What's this shit about you kicking Bonnie out of your house? I heard about it last night. She called her mother last night and was sobbing. John, I found out Bonnie is having an affair. I wasn't going to sugarcoat the relationship with this man. It had taken years after I married his daughter for him to respect and trust me. He knew I was honest and straight as day. The most frustrating part is that she's cheating on me with my sister's husband. I'm dealing with a whole family crisis. She said it was a rumor started by the gossipers in the office, said John. That they commute to and from work together and often have lunch together. She told us that the rumors about her having an affair with her boss were just rumors. I wasn't going to reveal the depth of my knowledge, but it had taken me years of dealing with this man to gain his respect. So I opened up to him. I didn't tell anyone about it except my lawyer and, of course, my sister. I haven't even told Bonnie and Rich everything I know, let alone the kids, I said, feeling emotions rise up inside of me. I held back anger and sadness. I have proof. I'm talking about video and audio files. The stuff they make movies out of. I would never go ballistic over a mere rumor. But this? I shook my head. Dr. John Prejean looked at me in shock. He could tell I was telling the truth. What are you going to do? He asked softly. He knew the answer before he even asked the question. What can I do? I replied. I try to soften the blow when it comes to the kids. They don't deserve to have their family torn apart. But I can't just sit on my ass and put up with it, John. Tell me, what would you do if Bonnie was here and told you that she had proof that I was cheating on her? I have to hand it to him. John was honest with me. I'd want your head on a platter. I'd help her bury you. I saw tears appear in his eyes. What about Jason and Deirdre? How are they handling it? We've had a few conversations. They have cousins who are in the same boat. They'll need your help later, but I don't think they're ready to discuss it with you right now, I said. Then added, Susan and I haven't even told our parents about this. It's too new and too soon. We're doing everything we can to protect the kids. Honestly, they're acting a little strange. They're not as upset as one might expect. They seem to be taking everything in stride. The 5 children seem to be wrapped around each other. They talk to each other more often than they talk to Susan or me. I have no idea how they interacted with Bonnie. As you can imagine, they are very angry with Bonnie right now. In time, that will pass. I told them they need to talk to their mother, but I don't know if they've talked yet. I'm not getting involved in this. I'm sorry, Robert. I had no idea. I came here today thinking you were being unreasonable. You're overreacting to gossip, John offered softly. I hope you realize that my first priority will be to protect Jason and Deirdre. I nodded. And then I'll have to help Bonnie, if only to support her physical needs. I want you to understand that I'm not excusing her behavior. If you say you have irrefutable proof, I will accept it. I want you to stay in touch. You are an honorable man. He turned and walked out of the office, slumping his shoulders. I felt more sorry for him than for Bonnie. Wow, said Susan when I got home that night. So he's found out that his girl isn't so virtuous. I bet he's shocked. You know we're going to have to tell Mom and Dad about all this soon. I'm thinking tomorrow night when you finish your shift. I don't want them to be mad at us for leaving them in the dark. I agreed. The meeting was certainly not a pleasant one. My father simply asked if I had proof. I assured him that I had indisputable proof. Like John, he was more concerned about how it would affect the children than how Susan and I felt. I could live with that. In our culture, children came first. Adults were taught to deal with the consequences of their decisions. Children were protected but also informed to learn. I received no additional information from my mysterious benefactor. I was fine with that. I had 4 videotapes of explicit acts that showed Bonnie and Rich's faces. I had audio recordings proving that this wasn't just a brief affair. It was deliberately planned and executed and had been going on for at least several years. I didn't need any more proof. Not only had Bonnie cheated on me, but she had somehow defrauded the family financially. How she had saved enough money to fly to the Cayman Islands remained a mystery, but the mere realization of it infuriated me. To me, she was not only a thief, but a fraud who had embezzled what should have been family wealth. Jake began investigating, using their social security numbers to find the accounts. He assured us that even if the money was missing, we could subpoena statements of the amounts transferred. Some of our questions were answered the following Wednesday morning. We met to set out all of our total assets. A court-appointed financial arbitrator was to review all the paperwork. I provided a calculation of my annual salary. I also found Bonnie's pay stub, which I provided to Jake. Bonnie was getting $5,000 a month, and my salary fluctuated depending on how much overtime I worked. But by the end of the year, we were making within a couple $1,000s of each other. Jake said that even without the prenup and my proof of infidelity, that would allow for a near-total waiver of alimony. On Monday, the auditor asked for income tax returns for the last few years. I was pleased to find sealed envelopes in the bottom drawer of our desk. Susan had to go to the accountant to get copies of her documents and pay Jake to mail them. She had no idea where Rich had hidden the copies and was upset that they weren't filed with other family documents, such as last year's tax returns. She knew his income was about $80,000 compared to her $50,000 and was pleased when Jake said she'd probably get a sizable monthly maintenance payment. That's what they call alimony in our state. Boudreaux walked into the conference room, followed by a sullen Rich and Bonnie. Bonnie glared at me. Her anger surprised me. I had expected her to apologize at least a little. After all, she was the one who had cheated and ruined our marriage. I knew how she clenched her jaws. She looked ready to start cursing me, but she remained silent. I figured Boudreaux had told her to keep her cool. Rich was clearly displeased and strained to keep a neutral expression on his face. The court officer introduced himself and his assistant, who took written notes and kept an electronic record. I assumed that everything we said would be transcribed in writing. Let's get started. Your attorneys have forms for each of you to sign. These are simply a written confirmation that any statements you give here today are true to the best of your knowledge. And any statements you make may be admitted into evidence. Our goal is to compile a list of all assets and income. The judge will review that list and decide how the assets will be divided. We will not discuss prenuptial agreements. I realize that is an issue in this case. Regarding the valuation of the car, we will use the standard Blue Book based on year, model, and make. I understand that you have children who are of driving age. Even if the car he or she drives is registered in your name, for our purposes, we can consider it yours if both parties agree. It will then be separate from the community property. We'll get to the money a little later. We'll start with you, Mr. and Mrs. Fontenot. The enumeration of automobiles, firearms, boat, and household goods, surprisingly, took only a few minutes. Even Bonnie's jewelry was no problem. I had them appraised, and the value was more than the value of my pickup truck and firearms combined. Boudreaux insisted that the solar system be considered a separate entity and prepared a document stating its value and allowable depreciation. Jake looked it over, made a few notations, and nodded. The 401k accounts were listed. I asked why, since I thought they should be excluded. No, they are counted since you have been married for over 10 years, but in your case, the value of both accounts are close to the same, so it shouldn't be a big problem, replied Jake. We then proceeded to the money itself. Jake entered the checking and savings account statements I received when I took 80% of the funds. Then he did the same review for Susan and Rich. It's all relatively straightforward, said the auditor, Mr. Jacobs. What bothers me is your income statements. There's a big discrepancy between Mrs. Fontenot's salary estimate and the income reported on your tax returns for the last 2 years. Rich sat up straight and held his breath. I've estimated that each of you has an income of $60,000. I nodded and said I used payroll and multiplied her salary by 12. Yes, but for the last 2 years, Mrs. Fontenot's income was much higher. Each year, she reported an income of $140,000. My incredulous expression must have been amused, but my loud exclamation of, "What the hell?" made Mr. Jacobs' assistant frown. "Didn't you look at your tax return when you filed?" he asked me. I shook my head and explained that Bonnie and Rich had insisted on having a new accountant handle our taxes for the last couple years. They wanted to do a little business for one of their clients. Everything was filed electronically. I just looked at the little return we got and didn't think any more about it, I replied. Bonnie went purple. Well, her salary is what you counted as her gross income, but she also received bonuses of $80,000 for each of those years. By my calculations, her net income is $60,000 a year, Mr. Jacobs said. I looked at Boudreaux, Bonnie, and Rich. Boudreaux looked uncomprehending, and the other two looked like they wanted to slip out of the room. In Mr. Jenkins' case, he got $110,000 in bonuses for each of those years. Mrs. Jenkins didn't have a copy of their returns, but I looked at the certified copies sent by your accountant. Susan asked how much extra that would be. Net about $80,000 a year, totaling about $160,000. So where's the money, Bonnie? I demanded hotly. I guess that explains why you two went to the Cayman Islands last Friday. You were trying to hide the money. What are you talking about? She began, then blurted out angrily. How did you find out about it? Are you following me? She demanded, but then pulled herself together again. No, I didn't need to follow you, I said. You did it yourself. I explained for the benefit of the two attorneys, and especially the court reporter. Both she and Susan insisted that all the kids install phone locator apps when they got cell phones. We used it as an electronic leash so we knew where they were at all times. It works just as well in reverse. I convinced Jason and Deirdre to talk to you last Friday. When you didn't answer, they used the app. You were offline most of the day. They kept checking. The other kids started looking for Rich. They were very surprised when in the middle of the day, you both reappeared near the coast again. We guessed from the time and the list of flights arriving in New Orleans that you were in the Caymans. Both Bonnie and Rich looked astonished. They stopped by your office on Monday and found out you weren't home. They saw that you were in Baton Rouge, and I'll bet you were transferring all the money into accounts you opened there. Jake pulled himself together. Boudreaux, you know as well as I do that we can get statements to prove the balances in those accounts. And it's illegal for an attorney to suggest that his clients hide money in an offshore account to avoid distributing the joint assets. Funny thing is, your clients flew there just hours after hiring you to represent them. And you should warn your clients that this kind of hiding of assets is a criminal offense. With numbers like that, it's a felony. Bonnie began to cry. Even Rich began to look frightened. I almost laughed at the look on Boudreaux's face. His face went pale and then turned as red as a beet. I wondered if the fat man was going to have a stroke. I didn't do anything like that, he declared, looking at the recorder and Mr. Jacobs' assistant, who was typing away busily. Susan looked at Jake. Can we get them to return the money? He nodded and said we'd get our share when all was said and done, even if we had to confiscate Rich and Bonnie's paychecks. 80% of those accounts will become yours when you and Robert prove your infidelity in court. They'll be responsible for the whole amount. But there's no money in there, exclaimed Bonnie. They disappeared when we tried to transfer it. Rich tried to shut her up, but she waved him off and continued. I think you know that. You stole them! She accused me loudly, sputtering saliva. I looked at her like she had grown a second head. I didn't even know for sure about the money until recently. I suspected there was money because of your actions, but I had no idea of the amounts. What are you going to claim next? Did you spend it all or did you lose it all? I believe both of those claims are complete nonsense, said I. She shook her head emphatically, explaining that they had tried to transfer the money electronically while at the bank in Grand Cayman. The transfer was denied, and they traveled to Baton Rouge on Monday to find out why. Both claimed that all the money had been transferred electronically the week before. They asked for an investigation because their online statement only showed the transfer, but not the routing number or account where the money ended up. Provide me with the bank information for the Baton Rouge account, and I will investigate. Mr. Jacobs said, I can get the results faster than you can get the results yourself. It will be entered into the court documents. As they left the room, Rich and Bonnie looked dejected. I wonder where the money went, said Susan. I mean, I went from a high rumor of a pile of cash in the account to a low rumor of it disappearing. I shrugged. I was thinking the same thing. Another mystery, I thought. Somehow Jake and Boudreaux had gotten our case expedited. I suspected that Bonnie and Rich had begged Boudreaux to do everything possible to get us in front of a judge as soon as possible. They stayed at the Holiday Inn for a week before finally giving it up and moving to an apartment on Victoria Street. It amused me to imagine them talking about opening up their love nest. I guess they were having a bit of a cash flow problem. I knew that the few $1,000s they had on hand wouldn't get them very far, especially if Boudreaux insisted on a large fee for his services. I had almost wished for the audio file to be sent to me, but I hadn't gotten it for some time. All 5 children insisted on attending the hearing. I allowed them to. In my opinion, since they were affected by the divorce, they deserved to be present. Jake explained what we should expect. Judge Guidry liked to conduct his hearings in a semi-formal manner. He sat at the table next to us rather than his usual elevated table. Jake, Susan, and I sat at the table to Boudreaux's left. Rich and Bonnie sat across from us, forming a triangle. The gallery where the kids sat represented the top of the rhombus. Following Jake's example, we stood up as the judge entered. He waved for us to take our seats. I prefer to handle these family cases in a semi-formal setting, he explained. That means you sit and speak when I address you. If you want to speak up, you raise your hand, just like in school. These events are usually emotionally charged, but I expect you all to be on your best behavior and respectful. You piss me off and I'll throw you out. Understood? I thought at least one of the kids would explode with laughter at that last statement, but they all held back. Well, I've reviewed both cases. Normally, we treat these cases as separate matters. But from what I understand, the evidence here is the same, as well as the parties involved. A sibling is accused of adultery. In the state of Louisiana, adultery in and of itself is not grounds for divorce. However, it is my understanding that there are prenuptial agreements that significantly affect the distribution of community property in the event of adultery. Therefore, at some point I will ask for irrefutable evidence of that adultery. First, there were some discrepancies regarding monetary assets. Apparently, there were allegations of an attempt to hide those funds. I have received the results of an investigation into this. It appears that Mrs. Fontenot and Mr. Jenkins do indeed have bank accounts in Baton Rouge with balances of $120,000 and $160,000, respectively. My heart jumped. Proof that the bitch had hidden a lot of money. So, the entire balance was transferred out of those accounts on the Monday before the divorce petition was filed. According to bank records, the correct passwords were used, and the correct confirmation questions were answered correctly. This indicates that Mrs. Fontenot and Mr. Jenkins either made the transfer themselves or gave this information to a third party. However, despite their statements, there was no indication that the transfer had been made fraudulently. Further investigation identified the recipient accounts and the names on those accounts. This is the part that puzzles me. All of the money, all $280,000, was split evenly among 5 accounts. These accounts belong to their children, Jason and Deirdre Fontenot, and Robert, Dave, and Cynthia Jenkins. The transfers are perfectly legal under the Uniform Gifts to Minors Act. These accounts were set up several years ago. I believe they were for college funding or to provide income in the event of the death of a parent. I was flabbergasted. Why was Bonnie making such a big fuss if she had given her secret money to her children? I looked at the judge again. There was a slight smile on his face. Rich and Bonnie looked shocked. Judge Guidry continued. After reviewing all the available documents, I see that the parent couple had a sense of responsibility, if not remorse, and gave the money they hid from their spouses to their children. Such deposits are non-refundable unless fraud is proven. Does anyone have proof of fraud? I was thrilled. Sure, I would have liked to get my 80%, but the realization that Bonnie and Rich had gotten nothing and the money had been divided among the children made me ecstatic. I could see Rich and Bonnie looking at Susan and me. They just knew that we had somehow outsmarted them and stolen their money. I knew that neither Susan nor I had done anything like that. When Judge Guidry looked at each of us in turn, we all shook our heads and said, "No, Your Honor." I bet they were terrified of possible charges that they had withheld the money and tried to hide it overseas. Aside from the looks, none of them gave the appearance of wanting to rebut Judge Guidry's remarks. So, the next matter we have to consider is the establishment of custody of the minor children, the judge said. At that moment, my daughter Deirdre raised her hand. He turned to her. Yes? Your Honor, I looked up online how custody is awarded, and it says that children 15 years of age and older can choose which parent to live with, she said. Yes, in some states, dependents can decide for themselves if there is no evidence of abuse. In this state, however, that is not the case. In my cases, I make sure to talk to the children privately and consider their opinions, stated Judge Guidry. Deirdre, still on her feet, stated, I don't need to talk to you in private. My mother cheated on my father, and in doing so, she cheated on our entire family. I want to live with my dad. She touched Jason's shoulder. He immediately stood up and said he wanted to live with me too. Robert, Dave, and Cindy stood in line and stated that they wanted to live with their mother for the same reason. My heart raced. Under the table, I squeezed Susan's hand. I will consider your wishes, Judge Guidry said with a half-smile. But it has not yet been established that there was treason, as you put it. Deirdre raised her hand again. The judge turned to her again. I also read that a 16-year-old can petition the court for emancipation. That means they can live on their own. And 17-year-olds can leave home without that petition. Deirdre remained standing as the judge addressed her. Yes, as far as 17-year-olds are concerned, it's an old law, but it's still in effect. It came about because young men wanted to enlist in the military without parental consent. As for a 16-year-old petitioning for emancipation, one of the criteria is that they must be able to support themselves. Is that clear? Deirdre nodded and said, Well, I have a college fund, and it just had another $56,000 added to it, not counting what my parents and grandparents contributed before that. At that moment, Cindy stood up. Me too, she said. Collectively, we have plenty of money to live on our own for a long time. Her brother Dave stood up and just smiled. Me too. We could live together and afford to rent a nice place. Jason and Rob stood up and said that if they pooled their money, all 5 of them could live just fine on their own. I looked at the judge to see his reaction. He could barely contain his laughter. I think if he wasn't in court, he would have laughed until he fell over. Let me guess. If I don't go along with your wishes, you will all petition the court for emancipation, or in case you're older, just leave on your own. The 5 heads nodded. Sit down, he commanded. I'll think about what you said. There's an allegation of adultery in this case. Normally, that wouldn't be a problem in a divorce, but both parties have entered into an ironclad prenuptial agreement that greatly affects the distribution of common property. So I'm going to ask you to present evidence that adultery has occurred. Jake stood up. Your Honor, I have been provided with these pictures of Richard Jenkins and Bonnie Fontenot doing it. Boudreaux stood up and said, I object, Your Honor. Anybody with a decent photo alteration program can take a picture like that. I have a picture of me shaking hands with the president, and another one of us playing golf. My son took them for me as a joke. I would like to point out that defense counsel has not identified the source of his alleged evidence. Judge Guidry looked at Jake, then at Susan and me. Jake nodded for me to respond. Your Honor, I am not sure of the source of our evidence. I was sent a number of video and audio files from an anonymous source. I took these photos as screenshots from one of the videos I received. I was reluctant to provide the video and admit it into evidence unless necessary, but I have a DVD and a thumb drive with the full video. I looked at Rich and Bonnie. Both of them looked like they were about to shit their pants. They shook their heads as if they couldn't believe what I was saying was possible. Judge Guidry looked at Bonnie and Rich to see their reactions. Their faces had turned purple and both were clearly agitated. Okay, do I need to reproduce the file that Mr. Fontenot just provided to the court? Or do all parties agree that infidelity did occur? I knew Boudreaux would have loved to see that footage. But when Bonnie and Rich quickly pleaded with the judge not to show the video I'd offered, he backtracked. Could you spare a minute or two for my clients, Your Honor? He asked. He turned and just looked at them while they shook their heads resolutely. I think we agree with the plaintiff's claims, he said reluctantly. Well, in that case, I will announce my verdict, said Judge Guidry. I will simplify it, as my judgment applies to both parties. As to the distribution of the common property, I believe that since all parties agree that infidelity occurred, the marriage contract will be honored in each case. As we had hoped, Susan and I were awarded 80% of the community property. Judge Guidry suggested that we discuss with our attorneys the actual distribution of who would get what. He hinted that we didn't want the court to get involved in the minutiae. As far as the custodial parents are concerned, I can say that the only acceptable verdict would be to grant Robert Fontenot full custody of Jason and Deirdre Fontenot. At the same time, I grant Susan Jenkins custody of Cynthia, Robert, and David Jenkins. As both plaintiffs requested in their petition, the non-custodial parents have full visitation rights. Legally, the divorce will be finalized in 6 months. The awards they received so increased their relative incomes that Bonnie and Rich were obligated to pay child support. Bonnie was to give me $1,000 a month, and Rich was to give Susan $2,000 monthly for the next 3 years. Each dependent child was to receive $500 a month until they turned 18. I thought both Bonnie and Rich were screwed, but Jake told us that the payments were actually minimal. In his opinion, they got off for next to nothing, and he said we could appeal. I shook my head. Susan doubted my sanity but followed my lead. As soon as the judge announced the end of the hearing, we left. Jake said he would arrange for us to meet to work out the details of the property distribution. I told the kids to go straight home, change their clothes, and wait for me. I needed a family meeting. Susan and I walked to the back of the courtroom where my father stood waiting. So when did you figure it out, Dad? I asked. Susan looked at me puzzled. It hit me when Deirdre and Cindy made those comments about the video. That's when you figured it out? I said to a confused Susan. Pissed Off 999 is a personality the kids invented. Her mouth dropped open in surprise. No. Dad said, I realized what was going on a couple days ago when I perused an old credit card bill. Jason and Rob approached me about 2 months ago about using that card. They said they were planning something special for your upcoming anniversaries, but needed a credit or debit card to make an online purchase. They said they would combine their money and refund it to me. They said it had to be kept secret, but the total amount would be about $500. When I got the statement, it turned out that the purchase was made at an electronics company. I didn't pay attention to it at the time, but a few days ago I called the company and asked what they bought. The electronics company turned out to be very secretive and at first refused to tell me until I pointed out that the card was in my name and the billing address and shipping address did not match. The kids bought cell phone bugs. For $500? I asked. Apparently these little spy devices were very expensive. Dad didn't know where the kids got the video cameras. Dad decided to follow me home to find out. He wanted to hear the rest of the story. All 5 children were waiting in the living room. They fell silent as Susan, Dad, and I walked through the front door. Let's go through to the kitchen and sit down at the table. Susan paused to grab 3 bottles of beer and held out one to Dad and the other to me. Jason and Rob held out their hands, grinning. You may be old enough to be spies, but not old enough to drink, I said simply. They shrugged. It was obvious I wasn't angry. Okay, who wants to speak first? Let's start at the beginning, Deirdre began. It all started when Cindy and I stopped by my mom's office and she wasn't there. Neither was Uncle Rich. This was right around the time they started phase 2 of the COVID lockdown. We thought we could get a few bucks out of one of them to see a movie. Anyway, the receptionist said they were out of the place and had long since left. It was well after lunchtime, so we decided to see where they were. You know, we have a locator feature that my mom insisted on installing on our phones. It showed that they were at a strange address, so we checked it out. It was an apartment building. When we got there, we saw Uncle Rich's car, so we waited. They came out a little later and didn't act like they were supposed to. They were walking hand in hand and smiling. That got us thinking, so we started checking to see where they went over the next few days. 3 days in a row, they came back to the same place and stayed there for about an hour and a half each time. Sometimes they would go there late at night, like after work, but before going home. We told the boys about it. Rob continued. We searched the internet and found these little bugs that you can insert into cell phones. Once you download the app, it works like a continuous phone call. But it runs in the background and doesn't interfere with regular calls. True, it drains the battery a little faster than normal. It sort of transmits all the sounds around the phone in case someone wants to eavesdrop. We talked Pop into letting us use his credit card to buy them. Sorry we lied a little bit, pal. Getting the phones to install the bugs and the app was easy. Then we took turns checking them and eavesdropping on conversations. We recorded anything interesting to share with each other later. So that's clear with the audio recordings. But how did you get the video? And find out which apartment they used? I asked. We looked at their keys. They both had a key marked 201. That's not their office number. So Jason took his mom's key and copied it. We went into the apartment a couple times and looked around. We decided we needed cameras, Deirdre explained. So we bought a few and a small transmitter, suggested Dave. That was pretty cool. The boy was excited about the technology. He didn't notice as he described the end of several marriages and the breakup of 2 families. At least Susan and I got some answers. The cameras were motion sensitive, so they didn't burn too many batteries. We hid the receiver by securing it under the couch. The receiver received information from the cameras and transmitted it to our receiver here. We recorded it. Seemed simple. So you took a video of Bonnie and Rich doing it. You also recorded audio files and sent some to me. I spoke carefully. These were my kids, my nephews and nieces. I couldn't cave in and ruin my relationship with them. But there was another issue, money. Dad, when Cindy and I first looked at that apartment, I realized our mom was gone, stated Deirdre. Well, not gone, but not back to where our family used to be. They had clothes stashed away, and Mom had a few outfits that I recognized. She had a makeup kit and towels and washcloths, too. We knew what they were doing. They'd work out, get themselves cleaned up, and then come home to you and Aunt Sue like nothing had happened. We were all furious. They weren't just cheating you and Aunt Sue, they were cheating us. Now about the money. I mean, the secret bank accounts were a side issue, Cindy said. When we looked around the apartment, we found some bank account papers. There were instructions on how to access it online. It took quite a while to find the actual accounts. We even spent time in Dad and Aunt Bonnie's offices, peeking in on them. A couple times, the receptionist let us in to wait for them. She giggled. We looked through a bunch of folders and finally found one in the bottom drawer of Dad's desk with some applications. Then we looked in the same place, Aunt Bonnie's office, and found more papers. Aunt Bonnie had kept, or I think still keeps, a small notebook in her purse. It had passwords and stuff in it. Of course, it didn't say secret bank account. But we could tell the password was pretty weird, much more so than the password one she uses for her cell phone. And it worked. It took a while, but eventually we realized it was the right password. It turned out they were using the same password for both accounts. Jason took the account into his own hands. We already knew that they, were fiddling. When we found out they had hidden bank accounts, we got really pissed off. We wondered if they were dealing drugs or embezzling money. Dave's actually the only one who came up with the idea of putting money in our accounts. Dave blushed. Actually, I said we can't let Dad and Aunt Bonnie just get rich and leave the rest of us hanging. We read about how to divide things in a divorce, and we didn't like the idea of them keeping half of that money either. We had accounts that Powell had set up for us, and I thought maybe we should take all the money. I thought the cops might catch us, but decided that since we were minors and it was our parents' money, we wouldn't be in serious trouble. The rest of us thought it might work, so we did. If we had known about the 80-20 share, we probably wouldn't have taken it, Deirdre said regretfully. It actually worked out better that way. And then you guys started sending me video and audio files, said I, looking around the table. I was at least a little relieved to see an expression of restraint rather than outright pride. That was the hardest part, Dad, said Jason quietly. We were really mad at Mom and Uncle Rich for what they were doing to all of us. We didn't want to hurt you and Aunt Sue, but we really couldn't do anything. So we sent you that first video. We kept our eyes on you. You kept trying to get us to visit Mom and Dad. We kept trying, and we knew that you were mad, upset. If you'd pulled a gun out of the safe, we would have told you everything. We knew you'd tell Aunt Sue. We kind of moved on. We already moved the money that Mom hid. I think we stole it. Well, I know we stole it. But we figured they cheated us, so it was only fair. I hope you and Aunt Sue weren't too upset. I looked at Susan, who had a look of amazement written all over her face from the start. "I hope you kids never get mad at me and Sue," I said with a smile. "But if you ever nail me like you did with your mother and Rich, I'll beat you to death. Even if it's with my walkers in a nursing home." They all chuckled at my threat. "You'll never have to worry about that, Daddy," said Deirdre. "You'll never let the family down? We Cajuns stick together." "One thing I don't understand," my daddy said. "You bought cell phone bugs with my credit card. They were awfully expensive. Where did you get the money and the card for the video cameras?" "From them. Yeah, they cost about $500 for each camera because they shot full video with sound and had built-in motion and sound detectors." "We got 5 of them," replied Jason. "Plus another 500 each for a hidden transmitter that sent a signal to a receiver we hooked up to Deirdre's computer. That's a total of $3,500 plus shipping. But we can get half of that money back if we return it undamaged. We already pulled all the cameras and the transmitter. We probably lost the cell phone bugs, though. As for the credit card, we used Dad's Visa card." "I didn't have a Visa card, so I said so." "We do now." "I applied for it and forged your signature," said Jason. At least he was honest enough not to look guilty. "It has a $10,000 limit." "We bring in mail every day, so hiding it was easy," added Deirdre. Cindy and I set up an email account pissed off 999. Rob came up with the name. He said what Mom and Uncle Rich did made him mad. The kids smiled and nodded, seeing that Susan, Dad, and I were really impressed. "So the bugs in the cell phone are still active?" I asked. Dave nodded and said that they would work as long as the cell phone batteries worked. "Thanks to that and the phone location app, we know where they are and what they are doing at all times," said Dave. He was thrilled when he realized they weren't in trouble. "If one of them is talking on their cell phone, we can hear it. It's voice-activated, so it's a lot of car sounds and just talking business. We took turns going through the files to pick out anything important." I demanded access to the audio recording. As a result, Susan and I had advanced knowledge of Bonnie and Rich's demands at the property division meeting. Bonnie was so eager to get her jewelry that she gave me most of the cash, as well as all of the housewares. We granted some of their requests without too much argument, but we made them grovel during the procedure. Susan shocked everyone but me when she suggested they both walk across town and back with signs on their heads saying, "We cheated on our spouses." The alternative was to appeal the amount of alimony and child support. I thought Boudreaux's eyes would pop out of his head at that threat. We heard Boudreaux tell them that they got off easy on the child support payments and warned them that Susan and I would likely appeal the amounts. Susan eventually recanted, forcing them both to apologize on their knees. Epilogue. I don't know exactly how it happened, and I'm willing to swear on a stack of Bibles that I had nothing to do with it. Somehow, 2 months after our hearing, the insurance company that Bonnie and Rich worked for found out that he had rented an apartment for a love nest with company funds. Although everyone in the office had gotten premiums for the past 2 years, for some reason Bonnie had had them much higher than usual every year. Rich managed to get big bonuses too. No one ever figured out why. When all this got out, he and Bonnie were fired. No big deal. The company didn't want any publicity. None of the videos ever made it to the internet. Susan and I couldn't have cared less, and we joked over beers that it would have been fun to make them stars. But the kids didn't want to publicly embarrass themselves. We understood their point of view. Bonnie and Rich now live in New Orleans, working for a small shipping company. Since leaving town, they hardly ever visit the kids, and they rarely even call. Last I heard, they are having a very difficult time paying child support and alimony. I wish them well. Well, maybe not. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.